As hunters relentlessly pursue majestic creatures for their coveted furs, horns, or meat, the animals they target sometimes possess an uncanny ability to turn the tables. Every now and again, the hunter unwittingly becomes the hunted. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times animals took revenge on hunters. Welcome to Final Affliction.
In February 2018, under cover of darkness, a trio of poachers made their way across the South African border from Mozambique. Their destination was one of the private game reserves along the edge of the infamous Kruger National Park. It was pitch black, and they tripped and stumbled through the undergrowth as they made their way towards the wilderness. They didn't use any form of light, as they wanted to go unnoticed, but they had made this journey before. They knew the way. Living in the remote village of Mavudza in the Mesengiri area, a lot of the people lived a poor existence. 3/4 of the population is illiterate, but most survive through farming. Fields of corn, cassava, cowpea, peanut, sweet potato, and rice provide a meager income for families and food on the table. Houses are set amongst Mozambique's sandy soils and surrounded by agricultural land. Only 4% of the houses in the region have access to electricity, with little in the way of future prospects. 50-year-old David Baloyi was no stranger to this temptation and, along with 2 others, trekked into South Africa on February 9, 2018. They sneaked into the Umbabat Game Reserve, just south of the Olifants River that flows through Kruger National Park and into Mozambique. They carried little with them, only a handful of butchery tools and 2 .456 Winchester hunting rifles. They were on the lookout for big game. These weapons could take down the likes of elephant, rhino, and lion. The illegal trade in big cat products, rhino horn, and elephant tusks are huge commodities in China and the Far East. They can fetch thousands of dollars, and although the poachers themselves only see a small fraction of that price, it can make a difference to their livelihoods. They rely on this income to feed their families. Rhino horn is more valuable than gold on the black market. Poachers risk life and limb poaching prized animals. With poaching patrols stepping up across South Africa and many other African nations, poachers can catch a bullet from armed rangers. In neighboring Eswatini, they have a shoot-to-kill policy when it comes to poachers. But sometimes, it's the animals themselves that poachers are most in danger from. Usually, poachers hunt for their game during a full moon. This helps them to see better and means that they don't need to use a flashlight, which can be picked up by rangers on patrols. They typically hunt in 3s. One will shoot the animal, the other will cut off the body part they are after, and the third will keep watch. Nobody knows for sure which animals David and his 2 companions were after, but when they crossed into the private game reserve that night, only 2 of them would make it back out alive. Stealthily, they stalked through the bush. Their arms were scraped by the long acacia thorns protruding from the trees. Their footsteps were quiet upon the dusty, dry earth. Their hearts beat quickly as the adrenaline of the nighttime hunt began to kick in. Flicking on their flashlights for only a few seconds at a time, they found a trail, perhaps the telltale paw prints of a lion. Crouching down low to the ground, they paused and strained their eyes in the darkness. They whispered to each other, each of them listening to the sounds of the African night. But they weren't the only ones out hunting in the darkness. The 3 Mozambican men may have been carrying deadly hunting rifles, but there was something out there that was far deadlier. With thousands of years of natural killing instinct packed into a powerful body, the African lion is responsible for an estimated 200 human fatalities each year. Male lions can grow to almost 10 feet or 3 meters long, including their tail, and can weigh almost 500 pounds or 225 kilograms. In some individuals, the canines can be as much as 4 inches or 10 centimeters long. They are generalist predators, eating a wide variety of prey species from wildebeest and zebras to gemsbok, giraffe, and buffalo. Although lions do hunt during daylight hours, they mostly rely on the cover of darkness to take down prey. Like most nocturnal animals, They possess a tapetum lucidum in their eyes, which reflects more light back through the retina, helping them to see in low light. Their night vision is 6 to 8 times better than a human's. In the dark, lions definitely have the upper hand or paw. As the men crept forwards, so too did a pride of lions. David wouldn't have heard the lionesses approaching, but it seems the three of them walked straight towards an approaching pride. With no time to react, David suddenly let out a loud cry as he was knocked off his feet. He squeezed the trigger of his gun as something huge grabbed his head. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the African bush, alerting rangers far and wide. David could feel the canines sinking into his skull, and he screamed as he struggled to pull his head free. He kicked his legs and thrashed around as the immense power of the lionesses pinned him to the ground. Amongst the commotion, the other two men dropped their weapons and sprinted off in the opposite direction. David had been only feet in front of them when he was attacked. They had seen the murky outlines of several large animals diving on top of him. They heard the struggle, the moans and groans of the lions, and the screams and cries of their friend. Sheer terror gripped them as they fled, running back through the game reserve. They tripped over fallen branches and crashed through the bush. They didn't look back. Their hearts thundered in their ears as they tore through the African night. Gasping and panting, they made it to the perimeter fence and crawled through. Only once they were on the other side of the wire did they stop to catch their breath. It was a 50-mile hike back to their village. When they arrived, they had to deliver the devastating news to David's family. David had been left at the mercy of the lions. He was easy prey. His friends had abandoned him. With no way of seeing the lions in front of him, he could have walked straight into the middle of the pride. He couldn't defend himself, and it would have taken just seconds before one of the lionesses closed her jaws around his throat. Asphyxiation and exsanguination are how lions subdue their prey, and David was no exception. It wasn't a territorial attack. The lions were out on the hunt that night. They were looking for a meal. Whilst David's friends made it out alive, he was devoured by the pride of lions. The gunshots were heard by rangers who headed to the area, but when they finally located the scene of the hunt, the lions had scarpered. All that was left of David was his head. Almost his entire body had been eaten. The alarm had been sounded, and police and paramedics arrived on scene when daylight broke. David's remains were transported to Mafuta Malati Hospital mortuary. When his family learned of the tragedy from the two others on the hunt, they phoned David's sister-in-law. She lived in South Africa, and so was the closest family member to where he now lay. She agreed to formally identify him. It must have been traumatizing for her to see him like that, but she confirmed his identity, and the family were able to grieve their loss. Lieutenant Colonel Moachi Nagopi of South African Police Service was trying to piece together exactly what happened. Nobody from David's village was talking. Nobody confirmed whether the trio had been out poaching that night or not. Instead, the evidence needed to be gathered. Next to David's body lay the hunting rifles and a large amount of ammunition. These weapons indicated they were out looking for big game. There were 2 sets of footprints leading away from the scene, suggesting the other 2 sprinted away, given the length of the strides. Some may say that David got what he deserved. With so few tigers left, there is a higher demand for the use of lion bones in Asian tiger cake and wine. Anti-poaching patrols in South Africa often come across the corpses of lions. Their faces and paws have been hacked off, destined for a shipment to the Far East. Coming across such gruesome discoveries is so common now that the rangers and anti-poaching units no longer become emotional by what they see. There are now more elephants than lions in southern Africa, and their numbers are declining at a rapid rate. Habitat destruction and loss of prey from the bushmeat trade, as well as conflict with farmers, are also leading to their demise on top of the ever-growing poaching problem. As long as poaching continues, thousands more animals will die, and some of the poachers will meet their terrifying final affliction. In late October 2019, 66-year-old Thomas Alexander was on the hunt. He had waited for the muzzleloader season to start in Arkansas. This allowed hunters to use older, more traditional firearms. It was perhaps a more challenging form of hunting, but so much more rewarding. Thomas set off to Yellville. He set up in a deer stand and waited. The sounds of nature surrounded him as he scoured the surroundings for any sign of a deer. His patience was rewarded when he spotted a deer emerging into a clearing. It was a buck, a magnificent sight with impressive antlers and glistening fur. Thomas's heart leapt in his chest. He raised his rifle and peered down the sight, steadying his breathing. The deer was a fair distance away, and Thomas held his nerve, waiting for the opportune moment to fire. As the deer stepped closer, its head bowed down, grazing the grasses. It was unaware of the danger, standing just yards away. When the deer raised its head, Thomas squeezed the trigger. A loud crack rang out, and the deer fell to the ground. Thomas lifted his head. It looked like a clean shot. He looked through his binoculars. The deer didn't move a muscle. Thomas climbed down from the deer stand and rested his gun against it, whilst he went to check on the buck. He was chuffed that he had secured a fine-looking specimen. He kept his eyes on the animal as he approached, but the deer wasn't dead. It heard Thomas's footsteps approaching from behind, and it suddenly clambered to its feet. Thomas was now only feet away from the animal and jumped. He was face to face with the enormous and enraged buck. Immediately it charged at Thomas, but he was so close to it that he didn't have time to dive out of the way. It drove its antlers into the hunter, and he gasped as they pierced his ribcage. He fell to the ground, and the deer gored him before leaping off and running away. Thomas was left gravely injured. He had made a serious error in judgment. He fumbled about for his mobile phone, which was in his pocket. Clasping his chest, he dialed his wife's number, and she picked up. He managed to relay what had happened, and she immediately called the emergency services. Thomas's nephew was the nearest family member to his location and rushed to the scene, arriving just before the emergency services did. Thomas was fading fast. His heart was giving out. When paramedics arrived, they requested an air ambulance, but Thomas stopped breathing and his heart stopped beating. They began CPR and instead drove him to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. The hunting trip had turned into a tragedy. The deer was never found and clearly lived to graze another day. But what had happened? Nobody knows exactly. Hunters are cautioned to wait at least 30 minutes after shooting a deer before walking over to it. Had Thomas waited that long, or had he been too eager to inspect the animal and walked over sooner? Keith Steffens from the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission said that it was one of the stranger things that had happened in his 20-year career. Weighing up to 280 pounds, 127 kilograms, it is easy to see how a wounded mule deer could cause the tragic death of a human being. But this next animal is much smaller and considered one of the most unlikely species to kill a man. Karma is a crazy concept, but one that is widely believed to keep the natural balance. It is the idea that if you do good things, then good things will come to you. Likewise with doing bad things. We like to think that if we are good people, then we will be saved from negative energies around us, as it should only be reserved for those who intentionally commit bad behaviors. But what if this isn't the way the world works? What if every action is simply random and has no consequences on the outcome of a situation? These ramblings are probably close to what Wes Perkins was thinking in May of 2011, as a large grizzly bear ripped his face off in between his screams for help. Alaska's Seward Peninsula is on many people's bucket lists, with beautiful glacier hikes, the historic Iditarod Trail, and even the opportunity for whale watching activities. Despite its appeal, visitors need to be constantly aware of their surroundings, as there are countless dangers in this icy wilderness. With most Arctic environments, the grizzly bear is able to thrive with its thick fur and expert hunting ability, which, in an area with an incredible diversity of fish and fauna, the grizzly bear is clearly the top predator. Despite this, These bears are particularly vulnerable in the spring as they are just emerging from hibernation. These animals will usually be in quite poor shape as they haven't eaten for months and might even have newborn young with them. They are weaker than usual and so are easier prey for humans. People have realized this, and so there is an annual tradition of spring bear hunts. This is where Wes Perkins becomes involved. In May 2011, Wes and two hunting buddies, Dan and Edward Stang, arrived in Seward Peninsula ready to hunt some bears together. They were avid outdoorsmen and regularly organized trips together to escape from the noise of their towns. A few days into their trip, they found the tracks of a large male bear and began to follow them into the snow using their snowmobiles. They could tell from the paw prints that this animal was an incredible size and would be the talk of the town if they were able to hunt and kill it. Suddenly, the tracks disappeared. Wes got off of the vehicle and searched the ground for any sign of the bear. Little did he know, the bear was watching him from 70 feet away and was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike, the moment that the hunter would become the hunted. The bear suddenly pounced, launching himself through the trees and straight towards Wes. Hearing the rustle behind him, Wes turned and was horrified to see the huge male bear rushing towards him with murder in his eyes. He tried to grab for his rifle, for anything that he could use in defense, but the bear was too fast. Instead of the weak and vulnerable bears they were expecting, this animal was in the prime of his health and ravenous from a long hibernation, about hungry enough to eat a human if he could get his paws on one. He knocked Wes to the ground as his massive frame smashed into him at 50 kilometers per hour and, in one swift movement, grabbed onto Wes's face. His head was dwarfed in comparison to this massive predator, and as he stared at the rows of teeth in front of his eyes, he knew that his chance of survival was very low from this point onwards. Almost immediately, the bear began to shake Wes like a dog would with a new toy, using all of his skills to try and kill his prey. As he shook, his teeth sank deeper into Wes's face, and he could hear his own skull cracking under the pressure that this animal was able to put him under. He bit more and more, harder and harder, trying to completely break his skull and end the whole ordeal. He forced his body into the ground and began to claw away at his body in an attempt to shred him into pieces. Wes felt that he didn't have long left. His pain was fading away and replaced with adrenaline that he knew he had no energy to even use. Pieces of skin and bone were being flung from his body as the animal viciously tried to kill him. When his two friends finally arrived to the scene and saw the horrific scene, not knowing if he was alive or not, they shot the bear quickly and from a safe distance. The bear let go of Wes while letting out a growl of pain before running into the safety of the forest. Once the men were sure that the bear had fled, they immediately attended to their friend, but they were horrified by what they saw. Wes's bone structure in his face was completely destroyed, with a terrifying array of bite marks and missing bone fragments strewn across his whole body. He was completely unrecognizable, and the majority of his face was hanging by loose strands of skin. He was missing his nose, his jaw had been ripped from his face, and, at this point, he was completely blind, clawing at his airways in an attempt to breathe. The father and son began to try and save his life, knowing that they would only have a short amount of time before Wes would become unresponsive, either from passing out from the pain or succumbing to his injuries. They questioned him to try and find out any information from the attack that may help him, but with no jaw, he was finding it impossible to respond to anything. He began to use hand signals instead, the only way that Wes would be able to communicate for a very long time after the attack. They radioed to Nome, the nearest town, informing the rangers of the situation and begging them for help. After hearing about the intensity of the attack and the condition of Wes, helicopters were dispatched in minutes, flying to the scene in an attempt to save Wes while they had the chance. While they were waiting, Wes drifted in and out of consciousness as the blood loss from the attack began to take effect. Once he was recovered into the rescue helicopter, he was immediately flown to Harborview Hospital, where he immediately was placed into a coma He spent 5 days in this coma and underwent 26 life-saving surgeries, totaling over $1 million in medical bills. His face was completely reconstructed with titanium, replaced parts of his jaw where the bear had ripped it clean off, and he was unable to speak or eat independently for many months to come. He was unable to eat any solid food, so everything had to be fed to him from a blender, and his sight was barely salvageable, reduced to only light and dark. He was left with just half a tongue, something that the doctors were not able to rectify. And while he is now able to talk, it's heartbreaking for a man who loved to talk as much as he did, having to suffer these life-changing disabilities. Once he was finally released from hospital, many months later, he then struggled with a methadone addiction due to the high pain that his injuries caused. He was unable to live life without the help of this drug, dulling the pain for hours on end, just for it to return with the same brutality as the day the attack happened. Luckily, with the support of his friends, family, and medical professionals, Wes was able to recover once again. The recovery process was long, painstakingly long, and there were times when Wes believed it would be easier to just die and escape the pain and horror of his ordeal. But he lived on. Despite the ferocity of the bear, the remoteness of the scene, and the horrific injuries that he sustained, Wes Perkins survived one of the worst bear attacks in history. Despite his ordeal, he says that he has no ill feelings towards bears, stating that they are neither good or bad, just wild animals, and people need to be careful around them. Wild animals will behave like wild animals. They are unpredictable and dangerous, but as long as you stay aware of your surroundings, then you should be able to survive. He is no longer able to hunt as he once did, but states that those who can should stay alert to stay alive and avoid the same fate as his own, having your face savagely bitten off by a bear and possibly meeting your final affliction.